The Black perspective is the understanding and explanation of people of African descent about their lived experience, their own perspective on what's been happening to them, with them, against them, since the beginning of time, but especially since Europeans came to Africa in the 15th century and began the process of creating the Western world with people of African descent as slaves, racialized slaves, Black slaves, which was new in human history. And so throughout this past 500 years, diverse people from Africa who never had a Black identity find themselves having to contend with this sort of essentializing mission where their skin complexion, their nose, their lips, their hair is used to identify and sort of frame them, shape them, circumscribe their potential. And the challenge is, how do you get beyond that, retain your African identity, but at the same time be able to cope with these new challenges? So prior to colonization, we were Yoruba, Igbo, Muslim, Hausa Fulani, Swahili. So we had these multiple identities from north to south. And it depends upon the level of contact that you had with non-African societies, whether you would think in terms of color, but generally not. But colors came up because we had several Arab historians, geographers, explorers who came to Africa, like Ibn Battuta, traveled across North Africa down the western coast and had discussions. And also from the 15th century, Queendom of the Congo sent emissaries to Europe and had ambassadors in Portugal. So there was that kind of contact, which led to the creation of a different kind of identity and a greater consciousness about color and the role of color. But so we had multiple identities, most of them around language, culture, and geography. But for the empires of the savannas, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, religion of Islam. But we also had empires like the Morsi Empire in West Africa, which had its own culture, own philosophy, own system, own unique worldview. And it's in the creation of the Western Hemisphere, you bring people from disparate states and nations and put them all into a boat and put them all on a plantation, that we have forged new music that has elements from multiple sources of different distinct cultural groups who themselves prior to the experience did not identify with each other, but who because of the experience now find themselves fully integrated in a shared reality, if I can say it that way. Because of the various ages that we've been living through, at once it was the Iberian Age, when Portugal ruled the world. They were the first to come to Africa. And actually, before the Portuguese, there was the Arab slave trade, etc. But we just deal with the Western portion. And the Iberian part, which was Portuguese and Spanish, followed by the British rule, the British domination, British world order. And then after World War II, the American world order. But through it all, African people responding to slavery, responding to an emancipation process that really wasn't liberating, because it led to apprenticeships that were forced, no pay, no work for no pay. And subsequently, in the last 100 years, sophisticated dehumanization, which has stigmatized people of African descent according to their look, their physical appearance, their values, their articulations, their linguistic, cultural perspectives. People talk in one way, different ways, and then they mean because of it. So there's 4 or 5 key types of anti-Black stigma or anti-Black racism that has been enduring throughout the Black experience in the Western world. The first one is about beauty, phenotype, where the physical characteristics of certain segments of the African population have been used to demean all of Africans, even though there's nothing demeaning intrinsically about it, but frizzly hair or nappy hair, flat nose, thick lips. There's some issues around buttocks, physical shape, which have been characterized as Negroid, but which are widely distributed across all African populations, subpopulations, etc., and considered to be ugly. You know, it's actually put on a continuum from finer to less attractive or least attractive in humanity. So that's one. And even to this day, you have people who look in the mirror, see those African features, and are ashamed of them, viscerally embarrassed by their own physical characteristics. That's a problem. The other one is perceived dangerousness. And this is really having to do with a gendered approach, where the black man, especially if he's tall, especially if he's big, especially if he's dark, those three attributes sort of come with perception of dangerousness. And sometimes if he gets mentally ill and has a psychotic break, the consequences can be fatal in his encounters with police right across the Western Hemisphere because of the intersection of stigmas, racial stigma and mental health stigma. And there's also the intellectual framing where black intelligence is questioned. And nowadays they talk about racial microaggressions, but a lot of the racial microaggressions are age-old stereotypes and stigma which lend question to the capability of people of African descent, that they're not capable of math, chemistry, science, humanities. They never came up with philosophy. These kinds of ideas, IQ tests, they can't do IQ tests, so they don't do IQ tests very well. Agency, they're not masters of their own fate. They're not creators of a new destiny. They don't have a destiny. Again, well, if you're enslaved, you don't have a destiny, that's for sure. If all you're doing is resisting the colonial rule, as many have had to do in the past 500 years, of course, your destiny is resistance. You're not creating a new state or a new civilization, that's for sure. But it's gone beyond that to assert that there's never been a civilization amongst these people. And we have people who've said that boldly, written about it boldly. I can quote David Hume, Scottish philosopher, who said, there never was a civilized nation amongst them, not even an individual eminent in either action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturers amongst them, no arts, no sciences. I tell people, imagine that. That's what leading thinkers in the Western world articulated. That you couldn't find one black individual or African individual capable either of intelligent creativity. Come on. If that's what the leading thinkers thought, what did average uneducated people think? I hesitate to speculate. Defining black humanity is a very interesting and challenging question, but at the same time, profoundly powerful going forward. I think black humanity is first and foremost African humanity. And when I say African humanity, we are all Africans. There it is. We are all Africans genetically, anthropologically. We are one species, an African species, with a few recent outshoots, never going back more than 100,000 years, because African Homo sapiens sapiens appeared about 230,000 years ago in the Omo Valley, as we are today, and were first black because that's where they had to be black to survive in the Omo Valley of southern Ethiopia. And as time progressed, they diversified, different hues, different shades, different types of hair, different features. And so they've always been reflective and representative of all humanity. And I think that's what it is. I think black humanity is all humanity, but because of this anti-black experience of the past 5 centuries, which has been definitive, that has to be a definitive component going forward. Repudiating all of that racism addressing it as a priority so that we understand our human experience very differently going forward. So it's about being African, but it's also about including others into the picture, and how we do that. How do we define ourselves in a way that embraces our own diversities as well as the broader diversities of the planet? Because we want our children to marry who they want, live with whomever they want, go wherever they want, and still be African. I want the world to know that all that we have today has African ingredients. There's no food that you can conceive of that doesn't have African spices, African meat, African rice. You name it, there are African ingredients in it. And that despite the fact that others have tried to extricate and extract what was too glaringly African to begin with. So if you look at medicine, for instance, where it's often thought that the Greeks were the mothers and fathers of medical science, right? There's a lot of African contributions to medical science, which in terms of recorded history begins with Imhotep, includes the Ebers papyrus, the Edwin Smith papyrus as documented, evidence-based for what Africans have contributed thousands of years ago, coming right through to the modern African experience, where we see that Africans who were enslaved and brought to the West continue to contribute, even in their disadvantaged state, to the advancement of medical science. And I reference an African named Onesimus, brought to Boston from West Africa, maybe from Ghana, in 1716, about 300 years ago. And when Boston was facing their epidemic, smallpox epidemic, which was wipe people out back then, Onesimus introduced the idea of variolation to North America. And variolation is a foundation of vaccination science, believe it or not. And the person who owned him didn't believe him at first, but then he consulted other Africans, interviewed other Africans. Cotton Mather was his name, and established that what he said was true. What he said worked. He said that back in Africa, when they were facing an infectious disease, they used to go around the village, take somebody who was sick, scratch them, take the pus, and then go around the village sticking healthy people. And that's why, and those healthy people sometimes would get a little bit sick, but they could face that sickness, no problem. They do it in Ethiopia, they actually drink it. They make the kids, the healthy kids, drink. They make a drink out of the pus, scrape people's skin and make a drink. And that's variolation, inoculation. And different cultures have variations of it, but what's important from a Black point of view is that this is the person who introduced it to North America. The same North America that says African people have no intelligence, no medical tradition, no capability even of developing medicine. Wrong. If you look at mathematics, the same. It's not often thought that we develop sine, cosine, tangent, cotangent, attributed to the Greeks. Not so. Again, I don't have the time to sort of delve into the text to sort of verify or corroborate what I'm saying, but it's been 4 decades, maybe even 5 decades, where people have been demonstrating that the inconsistencies in some of the claims, medicine, math, architecture, patios. Look at your patios. Believe it or not, patios via Haiti, introduced from Africa. Patios. Every time you're sitting down comfortably in your patios, enjoying a nice evening meal or evening drink, think Africa, patios. Anytime you're eating rice, African rice. You know, and slavers, when they went to Africa, didn't just go picking up anybody on the ocean, on the Atlantic Ocean or on the coast. In some cases, they had specific demands, specific requests. And one of those requests involved women from Sierra Leone, Mende women. These women had expertise in rice cultivation. And it's their expertise that laid the foundations for cultivation in the United States, in South Carolina. So rice is now a healthy export product, but it might never have been were it not for the contributions of these African women who didn't want to make their contributions, by the way, because they were enslaved, but at the same time were forced to and contributed to Western agricultural sciences, if you will. So I've talked about medicine, I've talked about math, I've talked about agriculture, I could talk about architecture. You name the field, we can have a conversation. Why is it important to have this conversation about racism, anti-Black racism? It's important because what happened is prejudice, simple prejudice, which is everybody has prejudices, all human groups. I think prejudice is human. To be human is to be prejudiced against somebody, some group, some ethnicity, someone that you don't know, you're generalizing. We all do it. Sometimes we get caught and we all apologize for it. It's to be human. But what happened with Western racism is that it grounded itself in science. And over the past 2 centuries, what we have now is a dogma that some people refer to as anti-Black racism. But anti-Black racism has evolved from efforts to sort of measure the heads of people of Africa to find smaller heads, measure their penises to find bigger penises, brains, IQ. The effort goes on to sort of quantify and reduce in scope and in scale the capability and potential of people of African descent. It's a dogma, and it's embedded in the culture of Western civilization. And the question is, how do we get it out? Well, that's a long-term project, getting it out, because it's embedded. And stigma is a idea where ideas don't come to play until you deal with it. So you never think about that you wouldn't want your daughter to marry somebody who is mentally ill. It doesn't occur to you. You're not walking around with mental health prejudice until your daughter or your son comes home with someone who is addicted to opioids. And you say, not here, son. I know you love him or her, but not here, son. All of a sudden, you didn't think you were prejudiced towards people with mental illness. Then all of a sudden you find out you're prejudiced towards people with mental illness because you have to deal with it. And so a lot of people don't think they have anti-Black racism, but the culture has anti-Black racism. And it's only when you have to deal with it you realize it exists. But we know, people of African descent know it's there always, because we have this constant experience of double standards. Our lives have less value. Our efforts have to be better than others in order to get the same grade. I mean, it's a constant double standard. And the question for us is, in the short term, how do we cope? But in the long term, how do we transform ourselves and transform the system so that we can all live together better, all be real? That's what it is. So we want to cope today so that we're not debilitated by this quote-unquote anti-Black racism, but we want to transform the future so that in the future, it's a non-issue for everybody. That's what we want.